Uh, Thanks for coming to this event, a lecture by Dr. Stephen Morgan on the topic of inequality, opportunity, and proposals for education reform. So before we start, I would like to thank Dr. Morgan for being here, and I would like to introduce Dr. Morgan to you briefly. So Dr. Morgan is the Jan Rock Zubro 77 Professor in Social Sciences at Cornell University and an Associate Director of the Cornell Population Center. He received a PhD in Sociology from Harvard University and a Master of Philosophy in Comparative Social Research from Oxford University and a BA in Sociology from Harvard University. Beyond Cornell, he is a member of the board of overseas of the General Social Survey and the Socioeconomic Status Expert Panel, convened by the U.S. Department of Education to develop a new measure of socioeconomic status for federal reporting of the results of the National Assessment of Educational Progress testing program, often referred to as the nation's report card. His current areas of research include education, inequality, demography, and methodology, and he's the author of several journal articles and books in this field. So should you have any questions, you please do not hesitate during his speech, and please welcome Dr. Morgan.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation, which I understand was extended by the former president of the Turkish Student Association last year when I was on sabbatical, and so then I was contacted again. I am happy to join you on only my second trip to Syracuse University in 14 years while living there. I talked with Sefa. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are, Sefa, about what I should do for my lecture. And we went through various options, from me doing a formal PowerPoint to what we ended up with, which was something more informal than that, because he expressed the opinion that we were all tired of PowerPoint presentations. And that means thank you for the kind introduction. You really are welcome to ask questions. If this turns into a discussion more than a lecture, that's perfectly fine with me. And I'm prepared to talk about really anything that's related to the title, which I picked last week, Inequality, Opportunity, and Proposals for Education Reform. Happy to talk about any aspect of inequality, any aspect of opportunity for education reform. Yes, and so I wanted to pass these again, more than that. How many, so just to get a sense of who's in the room, how many of you have spent time in a public school, K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade in the United States? I have. I went to. Okay, so how many of you pay attention or have seen the various policy proposals that are on the table for transforming education in the United States? Okay. So we have a mixed group here, and so this probably will work. But I may be talking to a couple different types of people in the room. So if there's any point, and I start talking about something that you're simply unfamiliar with, just interrupt me and say, what are you talking about? Because I typically talk with crowds that are, if they're not sociology professors, they're more likely to be education researchers. So there's a lot of tacit understanding, and they don't have to explain certain things. So no question is too simple. If there's something that you really want to ask about, just interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll just barrel on through, and you won't know what the heck I'm talking about or something. Okay, so what I've done. So don't look ahead too far in my little eight slides here. So, but notice first of all, slide 1. All right, so I didn't give you PowerPoint. I gave you 8 PowerPoint slides on a handout. So see, I can't really break from the institution itself too much. But let's first celebrate the fact that today is 11/12/13, which is a rare occurrence. And I noticed that November 12, 2013. So there you go. That's the only thing that's on the first slide. What I want to do is talk to you about some of the standard explanations for why it is we have inequality in educational outcomes in the United States, and try and dispel a few myths about what are some not particularly persuasive explanations, and also give you a sense of where I think education policy is headed if we get that far. So first of all, we have, in many ways, the most complex education system in the world because we don't have a centralized system that is imposed upon all schools throughout the country. We have a patchwork of 50 states, a ton of different school districts within those states, and a lot of local control over everything from how schools are funded up through what curriculum is delivered. I don't know much about education in Turkey. Perhaps you can tell me a little bit so I can understand. I have taught students from Turkey. I have one fabulous undergrad who went off to do the sociology program at Stanford named Esmer Barak. But that is the extent of my knowledge of all things Turkish, and it's really just through the first time. But if you hear the education reform dialogue in the United States, there's a couple competing ideas. One is that we have because the United States has been a country that has been willing to tolerate more inequality than most other industrialized nations. We have an education system that reflects the prevailing level of inequality that we have in the United States. And currently on the table, there are kind of two entrenched positions about how schooling could be improved, and perhaps then how inequalities in American society could be mitigated. And one of those, probably the oldest, and the one that almost all of my Cornell undergrads believe is absolutely true, is that it's simply a matter of funding. All we need to do is recognize that if we equalized funding on a per student basis across all schools in the United States, we would dramatically reduce the levels of inequality of outcomes that we observe. And so first I'm going to try and dispel that myth for you, that this is all simply a matter of money. It's not. But the reason it's not is interesting. The second idea, the second reform proposal on the agenda right now is various models of school transformation. Right? And these go, how many people have seen the movie Waiting for Superman? Okay, so all we need to do is create a bunch of charter schools in the country, and any of the perceived problems with our educational institutions will be fixed by freeing up these particular schools. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but I don't want to get to that yet because I think ultimately there's a bottom line to my message is that the schools that we have in this country reflect the level of inequality that we have in this country, and there's no easy fix to the education institutions themselves because they are actually a quite good reflection of the broader pervasive structure of inequality in American society itself. Right? So most reform proposals will fail to change much of anything because they don't get at what are the underlying determinants of inequality in society. But nonetheless, we need to understand what those proposals are, and even though there are no proposals, I think, on the table that are going to dramatically change patterns of educational outcomes, there are some that are better than others and may have some effects on the margin, so maybe we'll have time to talk about that. So let me start with school funding. Without getting into the details of how money flows into the typical school, it comes from three sources: local tax revenues based on property taxes, the state, meaning one of the 50 states, and then the federal government. And all school districts, public school districts in the United States, almost all of them receive funding from all three sources, but there's tremendous variation across school districts and across states in how much of that comes from the state versus how much of that comes from local property taxes. In New York State, we are a traditional state in the sense that that the majority of revenue that goes to our schools comes from local property taxes. Other states like New Jersey, Maine, I think Maine was one of them, where they've shifted the way in which schools are funded much more to the state level rather than the local property taxes. Now, but it doesn't matter how you do this at some level for what I want to say right now, which is the following. The amount of money we spend on schools in the United States is higher than at any point in the history of recording that statistic. So we spend an awful lot of money on our schools. the largest category of expenses by far is salaries for teachers. And the increase that we've had on average across schools has gone to one very measurable input into schools, reducing the number of kids that each teacher teaches. Pupil-teacher ratio has declined. So to prove this point, I could give you, if I did the PowerPoint version, I have 6 different slides telling you about how funding has changed. But let me just show you this little one right here, and hopefully you can read it. This is straight out of a recent government report that tabulates this. Let's see if I can, take off my glasses to read my own PowerPoint slide. Public and private elementary and secondary school pupil-teacher ratios from 1955 through fall of 2010. If you look at the light green bars, the dark green bars are public schools in the United States. And in 1955, if you look very, very closely, there's a little number that said, on average, the typical teacher in a school in the United States had 26.9 students in their class. Now, there's still variation in that. Every once in a while, classes get smaller, and once in a while, they get very large. But if you look as of 2010, that number has fallen to 16 students per class on average, which seems incredibly low if you've spent time in local schools in the Syracuse or the Ithaca area. And to some extent, it's difficult to figure out how you calculate and account for this number. And special ed programs that tend to be small count teachers in different ways. But no one disputes the fact that on average we spend more money in the United States than we used to, and it has not gone, although some of it has gone to things like providing health care for teachers, the vast majority of it has in fact gone to push down what a lot of people think is a crucial determinant of educational performance, which is the pupil-teacher ratio. And it's also the case that that the United States, in comparison to other industrialized countries, spends quite a lot on its schools. So that's what this next little one is right here. Right? So if you plot, the y-axis for this graph is the amount of money spent per student. Right? The x-axis is the gross domestic product in US dollars, and the countries that are plotted in X and Y, ignore the line in the middle, the countries that are plotted are those that we have good data on from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Okay? And the United States, as you'll see if you stare very closely, is pretty far out on the y-axis, on the x-axis, all right? Because we're a rich country. And pretty far up on the y-axis as well, right? We do not spend, so our GDP is $45,000 per year. Let's not get into how we actually measure GDP, and if we do that particularly well, it's a whole nother lecture. But we spend on average $10,000 to $11,000 per student in the United States, which places us not as high as everyone. Switzerland, the land of plenty, spends even more, and looks a lot like us. But then the straight line is then the sort of the best fitting line. Norway, with all the oil wealth that they have, has very high GDP and spends more per kid than we do. But we're pretty close to the expected relationship. Okay, so but that's not that for some people that are, if you're interested in minimizing differences across schools, levels of educational inequality. Well, first you have to stop. So what do you mean inequality of what? In the United States, there's a lot of different ways to measure outputs of schools. There's this stuff. The favorite measure, however, is test scores. So I could do this talk and talk about variation across high schools. That's people who had high school year before college, roughly age 18. We could talk about the variation in high school graduation rates and say that in some schools the rate is much higher than in other schools, and within those schools the likelihood of actually graduating from high school can vary a lot based on family characteristics. We could talk about college entry rates, who goes on to college. That would set up a similar sort of outcome. But the number one thing we care about in education research, and some would say we care too much about, is a kind of immediate measure of how much people learn the content that's on that test. Okay? So So test scores have become by far the most popular measure of outcomes of a school itself. And this has been increasingly the case for the past 60 years. So the first question is, well, okay, before we get into inequality, how are American schools doing? If you pay attention to the policy dialogue, it's professors can talk on forever. So I need to discipline myself the best stuff. You would think that our schools are falling apart, that they're just worse than they ever were. They just get worse and worse every year. Well, in fact, this is not the case. If anything, test scores have steadily improved in mathematics and stayed about the same in reading over the past 40 years. So that's what the next little picture is right here, number 4 down here. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is what we consider to be the most long-running, comparable set of tests that allow us to plot over time how kids are doing. We give them to kids aged 9, 13, and 17. They pick out 450 schools across the country or something like that, and then they go and give these tests. And this, the figure I've plotted for you right here is the math test scores. If I gave you the reading test scores, it would look about the same. The scores are scaled over time, so they're comparable. It's not exactly the same questions, but there's enough overlap in the questions. They can use a model to scale across time. And what you see there is the scores for 17-year-olds are pretty flat. Scores for 13-year-olds and 9-year-olds have moved up from 1973 up through 2012, the last time we've done this long-term assessment. So it's not the case that schools are getting worse if you take the favorite measure of educational outcomes. If anything, they're holding steady and maybe improving a little bit in math. A lot of people would say, well, that's just that. Don't get too excited about the status quo. Schools have never been particularly good, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's a reasonable position to take. We shouldn't act as if schooling in the United States is perfect and there isn't a lot of work to do. But when someone says the schools are worse than ever, and they're a lot worse, when a member of the Tea Party says they're much worse than they were back when I was in school in 1955 or 1975, there's just no evidence for that. Schools are doing fairly well on average. Now there's a question about distributions within schools, and there is some increasing concern that in fact in the past 40 years we've seen a widening, we've seen a narrowing of some traditional gaps, in particular the gap in test scores between white students who identify as white or Caucasian and students who identify as black or African American. But that gap has shrunk, but as that gap has shrunk, there is perhaps a slight increase in the gap between those whose parents graduated from college and those whose parents did not graduate from high school. And so as we've had a narrowing of a traditional race gap in achievement, we've had an increase in a class gap across achievement. It's controversial, and if that latter fact is true, it's not a very strong one. But the main reason, I think, that most people feel that schools are not doing well in the United States has to do with international comparisons. So, who watches sports? Have you seen the ExxonMobil ads for "Let's Solve This"? No. Has anyone seen this? Do you watch? No.
We don't watch TV.
Not at all. Oh my God. Do I?
I haven't seen this NHL. I wish soccer.
Ah, well, no Americans. So, there's ever since the 1980s, there's been this idea that the United States is losing its economic competitiveness. It used to be in relationship to Japan. Now it's increasingly talked about as potentially in relation to other Asian countries, China, the growing power in the region. And the claim has been that our schools are kind of not gearing up to fight the economic fight of the future because they're all failing. And ExxonMobil says in particular, in saying this to national TV audiences for the past year, that this is clear now in the educational evidence for a variety of comparable tests across nations. And this is true. So that's the next slide. So now you can flip it over. Even more difficult to read, but let me tell you what it actually says. So we started in the United States. I mean, the United States was a key mover in creating the whole system of comparing across countries. And through the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, there's a famous set of assessments now. They go back, there's other ones, but the one that people talk about most is called PISA, the Program for International Student Assessments. And in the most recent 2009 results, I think there's actually 2013. Do you know? 2013?
I don't know.
PISA. I think there actually is a 2013 PISA one, but the 2009 one is the one that is getting is the one that's shown on TV and the one that Romney and Obama talked about in their debates. And it's just like the test is actually very similar to the last test I showed you, that mathematics test called the NAEP. It's just it's a version of that, and it is comparable across countries. They translate. It's easier to translate math problems than it is to translate reading problems across countries, and so no one's quite sure what to make of the reading ones. But let me give you the math results. So the United States is 25th in the world if you rank by the ways in which this survey is conducted. Now, this is quite difficult for you to read. I have a slightly bigger version here that I can tell you. So at the top is Shanghai, China, which last I heard was not actually a country. So it's sort of odd that they start off in that way. It would be a bit like comparing a relatively wealthy suburb in New Jersey. They would probably come out really quite high as well. But the leading star in the international scene these days is Finland. Has anyone ever been to Finland? Does anyone have any Finnish relatives in the room? Okay. I don't know anything about Finland, but the claim here is that Finland actually does quite well because they have they implemented a real whole reform agenda that really transformed the education system in Finland over the past 30 years by paying teachers more, raising the standards for teachers, and really changing the profession and changing the institution at the same time. They also built in a kind of trying to copy a sort of testing culture and mentality that had prevailed in other countries that had traditionally done well, such as Korea and Japan. They see those sorts of tests. So then, if you look here, the next set of countries that do quite well. Canada does a lot better than the United States. So that's a real pretty direct comparison. We tend to think of that Canada is, I don't want to be too offensive about it, but they're not so distinct from the US, at least in basic demographic composition. It's a complex multiracial society as well. There's plenty of inequality in Canada, maybe not quite as much as in the US. But they have a more uniform education system that tends to put them more highly ranked in the international comparisons. And so here they come out really, if you just look at, they're actually third across all countries in this study. We are stuck down there with Portugal, Spain, Austria, Czech Republic, France, Italy. The United Kingdom is down there with us in a lot of other comparisons as well. But I think the quite reasonable comparison is that, well, we're not doing as well as Canada. I think that's a reasonable thing to worry about, especially if we're having a lot of U.S. Canadian conflict. No, we're not.
Most of East European countries are very rich.
Do I?
Like East European countries like Estonia, Slovenia.
Yeah. Okay. So, but the second point is, okay, it's true. We're 25th in math, and it might be better to be number one. We wouldn't want to be number one. It's not a bad goal to have. But we should look at how much overlap there is. It's not like these are dramatic differences. The U.S. is producing no students that can compete with those in other countries. The little shadings of the bars here are different levels of proficiency, and it depends where you put cutoffs for different types of proficiency. And the U.S. is on average not doing as well, but I would claim that in fact those are not dramatic differences in the size of schools. And a main difference between the U.S. and other countries is that we don't have a national curriculum. We really can't. We don't actually test kids on the same set of common material in the way that they do in other countries with centralized education systems. So it says we're sort of set up to fail by the very structure of the curriculum we have in the United States. And one of the reform agendas that is on the table now is to give us something closer to a national curriculum that would then allow us to more closely track who is learning, and all perhaps in the goal of being able to move up in these standards. And maybe the goal is to have people actually learn more. Okay, so bottom line on test scores is we're doing okay in comparison to the past. Now that we have information on how we do in comparison to other countries, we don't do so well. Right? And some countries that do better than us have created their success, like Finland, by education reform. And this may mean that we should do the same. So now let's talk about why education reform is very, very difficult. So now I want to give you a little bit of data, and that's these next three things. The one thing that people don't recognize about schools and inequality within schools is how much of that inequality is actually within schools themselves. Right? It is not simply a matter of there being some schools with lots of resources and other schools without resources, some having cultures that reward leadership on the parts of teachers and others that don't care. What we really have is a system where all of the schools in the United States have vast levels of unequal outcomes within them. And a lot of them can be predicted by things outside of the school, and the most important being the parents' level of education and other family processes. So I want to show you that graphically in three little friendly pictures. So the direction we're going to go, so this one here with a little crooked red line. Okay, so this is a little analysis I did about 6 years ago for an undergraduate class. I took what's the Education Longitudinal Survey, which is a survey of 15,000 students in the sophomore year of high school, so basically 16-year-old students in the second year of high school in the United States. These students are sampled in 750 different schools. So we take a random sample of public schools. There's also private schools in the sample, but I'm not paying attention to them now. 750 schools, and then we sample 20 randomly selected students from those schools. We do all sorts of, we punish them with some tests. They have to take tests. They fill out long surveys. Their teachers fill out surveys. Their parents fill out surveys, all in an attempt to get a complete picture of how this student is performing in school, what their attitudes towards school are, and so forth. This is a kind of a legacy of a program of data collection run by the federal government going back to in the 1960s. Johns Hopkins, that's the beginning. What I've plotted in this picture here is I've taken each one of these students, sophomores, and the y-axis is how they did on a standardized math test. It's very much like that NAEP test I showed you before, designed by ETS, the same people that do all these standardized tests that college students and some grad students have to suffer through in order to get into the schools they might currently be in. Each gray dot in here is an actual student. All right. The reason and the x-axis is how much money that public school gets from the local tax revenue. Right? So the reason all of the gray dots fall on lines is those are the actual schools. Right? So the easiest ones to see are the ones all the way out to the right in the graph. There's one that has roughly $30,000 a year in local tax revenue per student. This is, although I'm not supposed to say it because it's confidential data, this is a Texas ranching town with a very large tax base and a declining school population. And so when you do the ratio calculation there, they have this huge per pupil expenditure. So we consider them an outlier. The next one in with 20 students from it is actually a special ed school. So what I want you to do is look at the sort of the standard range of variation there, which is between something like $2,000 up through $15,000. And the red line is the best fitting line, so the on average predicted average test score for the average student in those schools. And you can see the red line does go upwards, just a little bit. So there is a relationship. Ignore this part now. Got it? There is a positive relationship between the amount of money spent, right? But it's not a very strong relationship, right? And this is shocking to people. One of the reasons it's not a very strong relationship is that the schools that a lot of people think are the traditionally lowest performing schools, in particular inner city schools in troubled urban areas, actually have considerable amounts of money flowing into them. Right? And so when you compare everything across schools, it gets very, very difficult to come up with any single story that can really capture the educational troubles in what are the most commonly, question.
But the cost per student is significantly different. Like, suppose in the smaller venues, the cost per student, like total student is higher, right?
So there is a claim that in order to teach a student, in order to teach a student with a family disadvantage, you need to spend even more money to make up for the family disadvantage. There's a claim that in cities like New York City, where it's very, very expensive to purchase housing, in order to get the same quality teacher, you need to in fact pay them more than you would need to pay them in Syracuse. So there's many arguments. There's endless fights on what's the right way to measure dollar per student, what's the right way to measure the payoff to each dollar per student. And those are reasonable debates to have, and they will continue, I'm certain, for another 50 or 100 years. But you know what? It doesn't matter that much. And that's because of what else is in this picture. Look how much variation there is within each of these schools. Right? There's a massive amount of variation on test performance within each of these schools. Almost all of them go from the bottom to the top on the test score distribution. Right? So the question is that random? Is there something about what goes on in schools, in spite of what goes on between schools, that tends to generate these levels of inequality within schools? So now let's go look. Let's test that idea a little bit. So now look at this one down here, bottom left. Okay. We'll take each of those 10,000 students. Now we're going to ignore their school entirely. We're going to keep the y-axis the same, math test. Right? Now we're going to calculate an individual level measure based on family background. Okay? And we call that socioeconomic status. And it has 3 dimensions: parents' level of education, parents' position in the occupational hierarchy, measure of occupational prestige, long story where that comes from, and level of family income, all right, from all sources. So it's there's actually, we do it from resident mother and father or parental guardian in the homes. There's actually 5 different underlying dimensions for socioeconomic status. So the people out on and then we normalize this to be a standard normal distribution. So the typical student will be sitting 1 standard deviation above 0 or 1 standard deviation below 0. If you're out there at 2.5 standard deviations above and no one quite makes it there here, you're really out at the tails. So just like we plotted a best fitting red line before, we can do the same thing for here. And you can see there's a quite strong relationship between individual socioeconomic status and math test scores. Got it?
Would this be the same for other countries as well? Do you have any?
Basically, the PISA results show that this is that there's less variation across country than you might expect in the relationship between socioeconomic status. There is some variation. The line will be somewhat flatter in some countries, maybe in Finland, I don't really remember, but in a lot of countries, even steeper than this, and so we're kind of in the range of where countries typically are. But that's not the big deal here. This is now my punchline for the talk in many ways, is this bottom one here. Okay. So now what we want to do is say, well, what's going on within the schools? So we want to transform the data in the following way. Rather than plot the y-axis as your actual tested performance, we're going to take your relative performance within the school. All right, we are going to subtract out from your own score the average score in the school from the other 20 kids that took it. So now if you're high on on the math test score, it doesn't necessarily mean you did particularly well compared to all students in the country. It may just mean you did particularly well in your own school. Okay? So we have a measure of relative performance on the y-axis. So we can call it the within-school math test score. And then we'll do the within-school socioeconomic status. So we're going to subtract out the average socioeconomic status from your school, all right, and your own socioeconomic status. All right? So we have a relative measure within school socioeconomic status plotted against a relative measure of performance. And so the variation that's left cannot be explained by anything between schools. It is only average within school relationships. And now we can fit the red line. And it's almost as steep as when we look across. Does that make sense? All right, so how could that be? So individual socioeconomic status within schools is incredibly powerful. And this is the most important reality of schooling in the United States that is too frequently overlooked by simple policy proposals that are all about transforming schools from one type of school to another type of school. It's not to say that those proposals wouldn't affect within-school processes to a degree that some of the inequality could be eliminated. But you're starting off at a very, very, very difficult problem that can't be reduced to a simple between-school solution. So now we can go in like 15 different directions. That's what I wanted you to know about. Now what I could do is, first of all, answer any questions you have up to this point. And then let me tell you the two directions I can go. One, I can tell you about what the literature says is creating those within-school differences, or I can tell you about the proposals on the table and what they might actually address, or some mixture of the two of them. We only have 18 minutes to do all of that, so we'll have to probably make some choices. First question.
My question is, when I see the data, it's mostly based on the performance in math.
Yep.
But in the United States, to my knowledge, math is not taught from first grade to the last 12th grade. So it's something like mathematical choice. How is that possible that we can use math to compare schools? Maybe one school doesn't teach math.
So most public schools have require some amount of math. Every state is different, every school district is different, but they operate within a range of requirements. It is certainly the case that math must be taught up through 8th grade for everyone. And in high school, most states require 2 years of math. Very few states, I don't know, there may be states that require 4 years of math at this point, but I just don't know. I know when I was growing up in Ohio, you had to have 2 or 3 years depending on. But what counts as math is is also a very sort of difficult thing. So let me just say that if I did reading test scores, you would get basically the same pattern. The reason we tend to do math is we think it's a more reliable measure that it actually allows us to separate kids out a little bit more. And so the literature tends to focus a little bit more on math. But you know, I could, if I did math just looking at elementary school students, so looking at 5th graders, I would have gray and red looking almost exactly the same. If I did reading at any point, it would be about the same. So I think the basic pattern is invariant to the choice of how we measure test scores.
There's one more question. Actually, it's a comment. Recently, I read in the news that the amount of income students that graduates make is directly proportional to the amount of math taught in high school, in school. So if that is the case, why the state doesn't require math to be taught from first grade to the last grade, as it is the case in Soviet educational system? I come from there. The math was the only course that we would take from kindergarten until the graduation, 12th grade, 11th grade actually.
So it's a long story about why we haven't.
Why don't we have math? Why it's not required from first grade to the last grade?
Well, first of all, you're not even required to go to school past age 16 in those states, so there isn't even a requirement that you finish high school. So why it is we have a varied curriculum is sort of the question. And our education systems have been developed with the idea that they should serve students of different types as best as they can. And so we have had a track system of schooling for a very long time in the United States, and the college prep track, which doesn't exist in that name anymore, it's a sort of more complex creature now, certainly does require math all the way up through the end of high school. The traditional vocational training programs where students who are maybe not even expected to graduate high school are prepared to work immediately, it has not been thought that to serve those students best they need to have 5 or 4 years of math. In fact, they need to have basic math, and then they need to have a sort of a type of applied math that would allow them to go off and work in manual labor. And so we've had a system that simply has allowed for that curriculum variation in order to serve different types of students. I think we're now in the move towards saying all of our schools should prepare students to go on to college, so everyone should get a college preparatory curriculum, and as a result, more and more school districts and states have been pushing up requirements in general, and that's where the debate stands now. And then there's some pushback against that, and the Obama administration tends to say out loud that they want to have go from number 12 to number 1 in number of students who receive bachelor's degree, number of people who receive bachelor's degree for every given birth cohort. But if you read carefully, they also say everyone should be college or career ready. And the career ready part is saying maybe everyone doesn't need 4 years of math. Maybe some people who are not going to go to college need to be given skills that will allow them to be useful to the employers who are likely to employ them. And so there is some pushback against the idea that everyone should stay in school to age 18 and get 4 years of math.
I have 2 questions. The first one is trying to understand the implications of the punchline, the last graph here. So you're saying that basically the higher sort of relative standing of family socioeconomic status, the higher relative standing of achievement test scores, basically, right? So, so from the perspective of education reform, focusing on funding or between school variation, this is very powerful evidence. But what about from the perspective of individual students and of their families in choosing schools?
In choosing schools, well, you changed the.
I know. Yeah.
You changed the question midway through.
Right. So I'm just wondering. I think this also sends strong implications in terms of like individual students and their families sort of strategy, right? So do you mean that, like, given the similar kinds of income, I should, my kids are better off in poor, relatively poor.
No, I'm not saying that. But I will, okay, so my recommendation to the typical parent, well, no, the implication, no, there's no implication. Your students will be, you didn't get pushed, your performance is not graded as they go on in school. It's not, your relative performance doesn't matter. It is the absolute performance that determines whether you get into Syracuse or Tompkins County Community College or whatever. And so there's very little payoff to trying to regulate your behavior in relationship to the average student in any particular school. Right? But parents do systematically overemphasize or come to a mistaken inference on how much schooling actually, which particular school matters. Most kids whose parents have advanced degrees and who have family income to be able to provide resources in the home, their kids will do quite well no matter what school they go to, because the range of variation across teachers and across curriculum in public schools is not dramatic. So the answer is that parents put in a huge amount of time deciding whether or not they should buy a house in that particular part of town so they can have access to that particular public school, or if they're in a very complex very large school district where they have a lot of inter-district choice options, like in New York City or in Baltimore, where there are all sorts of different types of schools with different themes and characters. Parents can put in huge amounts of time analyzing average test score differences across schools. And the evidence is just not there that really makes much of a difference. So ultimately, I would say that make sure there's a lot of books in the home they can actually read, get them involved in activities that will, engage their brains, and they're going to turn out pretty much fine as long as you've picked a school that's within that sort of range of not clearly troubled school where there's serious problems with the principal and teachers getting along. As long as you avoid those sorts of schools, your kids are probably going to do quite fine. But that doesn't help a kid who has substantial disadvantages coming from them, right? For that sort of a student, they should be sensitive to what type of school they send their kids to. And some of the success stories in schools recently are indeed some of these charter schools, which I don't know if I have time to say much more than the following, that have really tried to erase some of the disadvantages in the home that of the following sort. So one of the most, let me give the simplest possible version of this. Okay. The most famous charter school outfit is known as KIPP. Knowledge is power. What's the second P? It's KIPP, and they run schools. The most famous ones are in New York City, but they're now in many different states and metro areas. And what they have done, first of all, they have a lot of advantages. They have this committed set of young teachers who are willing to put in more hours per week than any normal adult actually would. So they have a kind of committed core of teachers that can't be replicated in general across all schools where people don't want to have to work more than a standard 40-hour week. So they have that sort of advantage, but they have an actual curriculum that's designed to teach the sort of mode of behavior and ways of interacting with the school that has traditionally disadvantaged poor kids and has traditionally advantaged relatively upper middle class richer kids. So, and it goes by the name of SLANT, but I can never quite remember this. It's sit up, listen, nod, pay attention, nod, and track the teacher with your eyes. All right, so where would this come from? Well, there's a long literature that suggests that teachers from really first grade on start grading students in two dimensions. One is how well they do on the spelling test at the end of the week, but the other is on behavior and whether or not they're following the rules and the modes within the school, whether or not they're showing themselves to be inquisitive. And when the curriculum then starts to differentiate pretty clearly in about the fourth grade, at age 10 or so, the assignment to the higher track, the advanced math group in comparison to the remedial math group, is based to some extent on performance in first through third grade, but it's based equally as much on behavior within the schools. And so kids who are showing all the signs of being just as talented on math, if their behavior has not met the expectations for good behavior that the teacher maintains, that those kids are going to be more likely to be assigned to the general or the remedial math track. And then that has its own consequences for their trajectory through the school system. And so what the KIPP idea in SLANT is, well, we're just going to, not only are we not going to have tracking that could make that possible, we're actually going to directly intervene on the behavior of kids who have not learned from their own parents that the way to get the respect of the teacher is to appear attentive at all times. All right? And so these schools tend to operate in rough neighborhoods where, in fact, not making eye contact with someone on the street is a protective strategy. And so kids are taught from an early age, don't look people directly in the eye, because that's how you get beat up. Right? When you go into school, authority figure, your teacher is talking to you, and you don't want to look them in the eye because you're doing what the local environment has suggested is the protective thing to do. The teacher would punish you for that in a school that's not attuned to these differences. And so the KIPP is the best example of, best is the wrong word, is the most publicized example of a case in which a kind of explicit attempt is made to bring up the students at the bottom not just by teaching them differently, but really by changing the way in which they behave so that they send off the right sort of cues and they're not disadvantaged by the school system. So if I was a single mom that didn't go on to college or didn't graduate from high school, I think it best I would advise that person, or I would hope someone would advise me if I were that person, to find a school that really makes a concerted effort to kind of erase the disadvantages of the home by having particular routines within the school that bring people up to the home. And I would probably also recommend they go to a school that doesn't have any form of tracking until 8th grade. I think that's basically the fewer opportunities to differentiate the students based on unfair criteria, the better it is for a student that has disadvantages from it.
Yeah, my second question is about what, I would be wondering to hear about your thoughts on Common Core.
All right, so this is the I don't know if you read, so the Common Core, so in order to Common Core is a complex being that was created by a loose confederation of educational think tanks, academic researchers, and the state secretaries of education in the United States. So it is not an initiative by the federal government, although the federal government supported it in the background. And the goal was to create a framework, since the U.S. could never have a national curriculum defined by the U.S. Department of Education. The goal was to create a sort of orienting framework that states would collectively decide that they would adopt, and then they would try and align their local curricula through pressure from the state on the local school districts to get as close to a national curriculum as the United States could get, even though it would, according to France, be nowhere near a national curriculum. So it's a big step towards trying to have some sort of common curriculum. It was actually designed quite explicitly to be able to provide skills that would make us competitive in the future global economy, and the people who were interested in designing it also wanted to have us do better on these international comparisons. And they're actually quite overt about that. It's now a big controversial topic because the conservative elements of in society, both elected officials and civil service groups, civil society groups, tend to regard this as an imposition of a federal standard on school districts, and removing from local school districts this cherished notion of local control that goes back to the 19th century with one-room schoolhouses funded by the rural community. My personal view is that, okay, and then the other interesting aspect to this is the No Child Left Behind Act in mid-2001 set up the idea that we should grade schools based on test performance in a very rigorous way. And in some ways, the Common Core is a response to that, and says, all right, well, if we're gonna hold schools accountable to performance on tests, maybe we should define a curriculum standard so that the test will actually mean something. And so, although it's not talked about in many ways, it was really part of the Common Core was an attempt to make No Child Left Behind a fairer system to all schools out there. My view is that basically, I don't have a view so much yet. I think I used to, I guess I think that local control is oversold. So I don't feel that there is as much of a positive benefit to having local control over schools as some people do. I do think that in relation to the prior question, our schools probably could be made harder, and more people could be forced to take more math, even if they're not going to go on to college. And so I'm generally in favor of making the curriculum more standardized and more rigorous. I don't see much downside to that. However, there is some compelling evidence out there, partly compelling evidence, that maybe the curriculum is being made too hard in the elementary school. That basically what they've done is they've started and said, if we're gonna be able to compete in the 21st century, we have to graduate students with this sort of skills. And then they've marched back from that, where you should be at age 18, in a kind of linear fashion down through first and second grade. So if you're not learning these particular concepts in the second grade in every school in the United States, your kids are going to be in trouble. And a lot of people say that's simply too rigid, that the patterns of learning, kids are very different, they develop at different rates. It's fine that just wanting to have a particular national standard for what occurs between ages 15 and 18 shouldn't too strongly determine what is occurring between ages 6 and 12. And there needs to be more flexibility at the lower end. So I guess my bottom line would be, I want to track this scholarship and this research and see where we are. The people who are anti-Common Core are just crazy, loony people for the most part, but there is a core of disciplined thinkers that is pressing for more flexibility in sort of first through sixth grade, and I think that maybe that's where I'll end up, which is not quite as common in first through sixth grade, but quite common from seventh grade onward. Okay. Technically, we're out of time, I think, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
Right.
Yep.
So, like all these results that
If you have somewhere to go, you can go.
Yeah, like this results are trying to assess the effect of like socioeconomic status of like students or like school success only based on that school, right? Without taking any individual differences into consideration. So how reliable would this result be? Like because some of the students who don't do very good at math might be really successful in some other way, social science or something like that.
Absolutely.
So how does this really show that actual effect?
So this sort of representation is just, we take one outcome, we divide it up between and within schools, and we show that there's just a lot of socioeconomic status is strongly predictive of that particular outcome. We don't use that sort of analysis to say, that person who, is down at the bottom on math is necessarily going to be down at the bottom on something else. So my guess is that you would see there's actually variation across individuals in their own performance on any given day. And so lots of stuff would move around. So don't attach anything to it beyond that general point. The big thing that's missing from this sort of a representation is all the other individual characteristics that could be driving performance. So simply, the people who've done their homework on the day before are going to be more likely to have done well on the ensuing math test. And the question is how much of having done your homework the day before is a function of having had parents that monitored you and suggested that you do that versus some individual level decision that represents the true grit of that person to perform at a high level. And sort of a more comprehensive analysis of that, we get into sort of 50 years of research to show these are the true determinants of achievement, these are the ones that flow from family background differences, these are the ones that flow from individual level differences, and then we have to let in the door the idea that there really is at least some range of innate cognitive ability. That a lot of people find it very difficult to talk about that, but people don't find it difficult to talk about the fact that there is some proportion of the population that has some severe cognitive difficulty. That's why we have special ed programs. And so the idea that that there is some 2 or 5% of the population that has sort of recognized cognitive impairments, but then once you're beyond the 5th percentile, everyone's the same. Well, most researchers find that unreasonable. There probably is some rate of underlying ability, but it's very, very difficult to figure out how to actually measure that since we have to figure out how to get into people's brains. But there is a lot more going on generating that cloud of points than just socioeconomic status between school differences. That's another whole lecture. Yep.
I think the positive relationship between socioeconomic status and math score on math test doesn't seem to be working on country level, because when we look at the countries, for example, some countries like, I think I'm picking my argument that I previously, for example, Estonia and Slovakia and such countries like these countries are much poorer than the United States. Their education systems seems to be working better than the United States, And then what does explain this? Can we explain this based on? Can we say that they have better curriculums or they have better education systems?
I know nothing about Estonia. I just don't. I mean, so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and the I'm sure there is an article out there that really has looked inside. There's been a lot of attention to Finland because they come out quite high. They do spend a decent amount, but they come out high. How many of the other countries that are reliably above the United States? It's just unclear to me how many people have done a real rigorous comparison of what's actually going on. So there's a lot of comparison, and there had traditionally been a lot of comparison on East Asian societies. And there, the claim is that what's actually going on that the U.S. is unlikely to ever get into, and one of the reasons they do so well is that kids in Korea and Japan go off. Their extracurricular activity is studying for tests. They go to these cram schools and they do even more. So the school is the formal education system is getting this huge multiplier effect of rather than kids going off and playing sports or whatever, they're on average spending another hour or two with someone teaching them, strategies for test taking and learning the particular sorts of problems that are actually on the tests. And so if that's all that's going on, I mean, should we really be beating up our educations? I mean, we're doing fairly well given that we don't force people to learn.
What is the source of?
But I don't know about Estonia. Is there an exam taking culture in Estonia? I don't know. The Finland story doesn't seem to be about that. The Finland story seems to be about very effective teachers who are doing their jobs quite well, partly because they're being paid a lot and they're given a sort of higher professional status than in the United States or than in. I think the most interesting thing is Canada. Why is it that Canada, which is a quite similar set of population, why is it that Canadians are doing better? And you'd think there would be more attention to that difference, but there doesn't seem to be as much. Canada's not an exotic enough place to study. It's much more interesting to study Finland. Be interesting to see, where Turkey will fit into this story 25 years from now. Be interesting to see where they would fit in now, but I think even more interesting 25 years from now.
What is the source of this now?
Which one are we looking at? That's the PISA, the Organization of Cooperation and Development. But it's not every country, because not every country participates in the tests.
Yeah, I don't see Russia, for example, former Soviet Union countries. They might not be good in human rights, but the math is.
I suspect they're, but they're are they an OECD country? Is Russia an OECD country? I don't know.
It is.
It is, but why? So then they must not be willing to participate. Maybe because they would do so well, they would put everyone.
How was the socioeconomic status established?
For this particular picture, it is literally the standardized composite of 5 things. If mom and dad are in the household, it's mom's education, dad's education, occupational prestige for both parents if they're working, and family income from all sources standardized.
Does it come down to the actual level of income because all other things that factor?
Yeah, actually no. So people think a level of income is the most. It's actually parents' education by far the strongest.
Okay.
Yeah. And it doesn't. And that's not surprising. You have sort of people who can end up making a lot of money but never like school and aren't going to push their kids at school. But people who've gone on and done well in school are quite likely to try and monitor and work with their kids to do the same. So parents' education is definitely the strongest predictor.
Then this kind of shows that if you're coming from an educated family, in this case you're more likely to be able to learn what you need to do.
That's exactly right.
Similar.
That's right. And occupation and income's always measured with a lot of error. A lot of people don't really know what their income is. What's your take home, your after tax, and so then you get a lot of error. So it's not a fair comparison because there's less error in education than in income, and so no one's figured out the exact. But there seems to be enough evidence that parent education is. Okay.
Thank you very much.